and by our now I mean the rationalist scientific view of nature, is that it is something entirely passive which we perceive, and that the act of perception, to become an act of understanding, has to go through all kinds of transforms and processing in the human brain. Nothing could be further than the truth. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Gaia hypothesis, which fundamentally is a theory about gas exchange in the atmosphere, but which really says that the planet is a self-regulating organism in which we are moving around, playing a role somewhat like an organelle in a cell. The consequences to be drawn from the Gaia hypothesis is that nature is not a passive matrix which requires analysis, but that in fact it is communication. That the perception of nature is the perception of nature's intent. And if we could, and this begins as a kind of outlandish notion, is nature talking to us? Is that what is happening? And ends, I think, in the conviction that that is absolutely what is happening. We do not live on this planet. We live in this planet. Hundreds of miles of atmosphere rise above us. We move along on a kind of membrane, which we call the surface, but which is really simply a symmetry break in the physiology of the planetary organism. The planetary organism, for us, is a continuous stream of communication to us, which we deny. And we deny it by strategies that have been spun out over millennia. One of which is, of course, the subject-object dualism inherent in our languages, the notion of the passivity of the exterior, the notion that mind is a phenomenon, in fact, an epiphenomenon of the functioning of brain. We are unwilling to see that mind is a flowing river into which the brain is inserted much in the way that a dipstick is inserted into a crankcase to take the measure of the lubricant. That's what we are doing. And there's a lot of talk about paradigm shift, what will it be, where will it come from, etc., etc. And people keep claiming they have it, but I don't think people realize, they have trivial paradigm shifts or mini paradigm shifts. The real paradigm shift that is being acted out in the 20th century is a return to the archaic notion of the primacy of spirit. And it was contacted first and most abstractly by quantum physics, where it was finally realized, when all other intellectual avenues had been exhausted, that particulate matter, conceived of as tiny billiard balls whizzing through empty space, was going to have to be replaced by a notion of fields, of interacting fields described probabilistically and not really localizable in the here and now kind of matrix that we are used to moving through. But they called the new concept of matter probabilistic or wave mechanical. It actually is not mechanical at all. Waves are not mechanical. Wave mechanical is a curiously bastardized kind of term which tries to have it both ways. But how many of us are quantum physicists, and how many of us who are actually have access to the instrumentalities that confirm these notions? So it emerged and is emerging then in other areas, such as abstract art and the effort by the precursors of abstract art, the pataphysicists, the Dadaists, and the Surrealists, to introduce the notion of an animate and active unconscious. The notion of the unconscious is actually an effort to blur the notion of the point consciousness of the ego, and to replace the model of the point consciousness of the ego with this more deployed and fuzzy notion of a gradation of awareness spreading out to the very earliest memories of animal organization, you see. But all of these intellectual efforts to launch the paradigm of spirit have been somewhat academic and removed from the ordinary experience of people. What is not removed from the ordinary experience of people is the availability of the psychedelic experience, conceived not as a kind of masturbation where the laboratory facilitates the experience through the production of historyless drugs absolutely empty of morphogenetic content, but through the acceptance of the fact that this generalized communication from nature is most excruciatingly focused and particularized in these information-bearing molecules that have been evolved over billions of years in the biosphere by the matrix of life itself for purposes of communication. All of life is really an ocean of communication, and this is now being understood even by the hard-nosed Darwinian evolutionary thinkers. It is really not all tooth and claw. It is not survival of the fittest. It is survival of those who can cooperate best with those around them, of the same and different species. Well, the essence of coordinating cooperation is communication. And the essence of communication is the free flow of linguistic intent. We're all familiar, I'm sure, with the way in which ants regulate their behavior by the laying down of pheromones. And that seems quite acceptable to us because we say, well, the average ant is not such a big deal. It is the hive which is so exquisitely organized and coordinated and able to execute its intent and carry out its plans. But, have you noticed that the individual atoms of the human hive are no great shakes either in most cases? I'm speaking now to an intellectual elite, self-selected by being able to get yourselves here this evening to this kind of an event. But I'm sure you all are aware of the public opinion polls which show that the average high school graduate cannot locate Venezuela on a map. And similar things, believes that Hermann Goering served in the Nixon administration. And someone said, but he did, didn't he? Only his spirit. So coordination of communication is really what these psychedelic compounds are about.